Okay, we are ready. So good morning and welcome to the 5 W's of Planning a Digital Imaging Project. This is part one of a two-part series that we are doing because we have discovered in our planning process that this topic is so huge that we could not fit it all into 1 hour. So we have loosely organized these two parts into the what, when, and why of the project and the who and how. So today's what, when, and why is going to be what imaging is, when it's a good idea, why it's a good idea, and when it's not cost effective. And then, lots of other questions you'll need to ask yourself if you're considering an imaging project or you're advising others on doing their own projects. We have both state agencies and local governments with us today, including some state universities and private sector folks and a few people from other states and even other countries. So thank you all for coming to our webinar today. If you're joining us for the first time with absolutely no idea who I am or who we are, let me just briefly introduce you to the Records Management Assistance Unit. There are government information analysts here in RMA who are here to answer any questions you have on pretty much any aspect of records management. So here's what we hope you take away from today's webinar. You should, first of all, understand the basic concepts of digital imaging and the related laws and rules for Texas government agencies. You should understand why indexing is such an important part of a scanning project. You should be able to apply retention schedules to scanned images. You'll have a better idea of when it's a good idea to image and when it's not. And as records managers, you can use that information to advise other offices within your agency who don't know as much as you, who might be considering scanning. And you'll know the laws and rules for source document destruction, and hopefully be able to answer those questions for others. In other words, you'll be able to tell people when it's a good idea to keep the paper original of a scanned record and when it might be better to save space by destroying it. First, the what of planning an imaging project. So of course we have to start with what is imaging? So imaging means converting a piece of paper or a photograph from a human-readable object into a machine-readable image, a JPEG, a TIFF, a PDF, whatever. The two images here are an example of imaging. On the left, that's my hand holding a paper RMO designation form from the Office of the Governor. And then on the right, it's a screenshot of the same document that I've scanned into a PDF. Imaging is also referred to as scanning, of course, and sometimes it's also called digitization. Imaging can also mean converting paper into microfilm, and digitization can also mean converting pretty much any analog format, maybe an audio-visual format like a cassette tape, into a digital audio file like a WAV file or an MP3. But today, we're just going to be focusing on the process of converting paper documents into digital images. So I mentioned the term machine-readable because that's what imaging produces, a machine-readable object. When I say machine-readable, this is what I mean. Computers read ones and zeros. I, for one, don't look at this string of numbers and say, oh, the governor's office wants to change their RMO. Once you've imaged something, that object becomes technology dependent. So reading it will now depend on having a computer and software that will display it. Now indexing. So indexing is a term that you will need to be very familiar with when you're imaging. Digital images are not automatically text searchable. Usually your computer knows how to display the image, so how to actually show it to you on your computer screen, but it doesn't necessarily know that it's looking at a picture of a document containing words. So it's not going to know that the picture contains a name, a date, a case number, or any terms. And that is where indexing comes in. If you want to be able to find that image after you scan it, you'll have to assign some metadata to each document. For our purposes today, we are going to think of metadata as structured search terms. So search terms that a human adds to a digital file to make it searchable. Now an index can be simple or sophisticated. Mariana is going to be talking more about indexing and metadata in part 2. And she's also going to talk about optical character recognition, or OCR, and how that does make images text searchable. So I'm really not getting into that. But I want to show you an example here of what an index can look like. So this is the database that we use to retrieve our own scanned images and the index that we use with it so that you have a sense of what a basic index can look like. So what you're looking at here is our compliance database, RMOG. That's the name of it. This is a FileMaker Pro database that we use to track the compliance status and compliance paperwork submissions of all 10,000 local governments in the state of Texas. When we're looking up a particular local government, there are a lot of ways that we might want to search. We might want to search by the RMO's name. We might want to search by the government name, so City of Austin, Harris County MUD number 8075, etc. Or if we know it, we can search by the government's unique ID. Now here's where the imaged file comes in. So almost all of the entries in RMOG have supporting documentation attached to them. Like an RMO designation form, a records control schedule, any policies or resolutions, and so forth. And all of these documents are submitted to us in paper and then scanned. And that is called their compliance file. Okay, so when I click on this handy compliance files button in the database, up pops the PDF of the compliance file. And as you can see, each file is assigned a unique ID number. And this ID number connects the PDF to that database. Without the database, here's how retrieving the document would work. So let's say someone asks us who the current RMO for the City of Austin is. Okay, so first we'd have to look up their unique ID. Government IDs are assigned according to a very strict naming convention. First, you would have to look up the county code for Travis County, 227. Then you would have to look up the 2-digit code for type of government, so 16 means municipality, and then so on. Once you had figured out that unique ID number, then you'd go to our shared drive to find the PDF of the compliance file. If it's been scanned, you click on 227-16001. That's a lot more work than searching for City of Austin in that database and then clicking the compliance files button. So the database really speeds up our retrieval times. But I will point out here, having these files scanned in the first place really sped up our retrieval times because before they were scanned, whenever we needed to see a compliance file, we'd have to ask our administrative assistant to drive out to the State Records Center to actually go pull the folder from an old file cabinet. So scanning images and using a database to retrieve them really has sped up our retrieval times and has made us more efficient. All right, so moving on from indexing, what can you actually scan according to state law? And the short answer is, as far as TSLAC is concerned, that's Texas State Library, you're allowed to scan pretty much anything. For local governments, so cities, counties, school districts, community colleges, and so forth, the law says any local government record data may be stored electronically in addition to or instead of source documents in paper or other media. And not only is it okay for a record to exist in born digital format, born digital meaning it only ever existed electronically like a database, but it's okay for an electronic record to replace its paper original. However, that does have a big caveat attached to it, which is that if you're storing a record electronically, you have to follow the rules for managing electronic records that apply to local governments. And those rules are printed in Bulletin B, Electronic Records Standards and Procedures. For our state agencies and state universities, the answer is about the same. As far as TSLAC is concerned, anything you want to scan is fair game. But again, the creation and storage of that electronic record has to be done in accordance with TSLAC's adopted rules, which for state agencies is Bulletin 1. Okay, and then finally, what retention rules apply to an imaged document? Well, it's important to remember, where retention is concerned, a record is a record is a record. The format in which a record exists does not affect its retention period. As long as the nature and content of the records stay identical to what is in the retention schedule, then there is no need to change your retention schedule to reflect the records are now being kept electronically. And along those lines, there's no need to notify TSLAC that the format of the official record is changing. To us, it doesn't matter that what used to be paper is now a JPEG, as long as you're keeping that JPEG for the same amount of time. Okay. So next, let's look at why would you consider imaging, and why might you decide not to image? So what are the benefits of doing an imaging project? Mainly, you image records because it can create efficiencies in the way you operate. It can really improve your overall effectiveness as a government agency. Imaging records will probably speed up your retrieval times. So once something's scanned, you'll click a few times and the document appears on your screen. Boom. Next, in a paper environment, only one person can look at the same folder at the same time, I guess, unless you're all crowding around someone's desk. But in a digital environment, multiple users can view the same document at the same time. And that goes hand in hand with eliminating the problem of folders going missing. Having scanned images definitely facilitates information sharing and dissemination, and we'll talk more about that in the next few slides when we talk about access considerations. So these are our primary benefits of imaging. These are the main reasons you'll probably be doing it. Now, some secondary benefits of imaging. If you intend to destroy the paper source document after you've scanned it, then you can save a lot of physical storage space by storing these documents electronically. And scanning documents also provides backup copies of records that can be stored in multiple locations. And I know that's especially important for folks in more disaster-prone places. But even though there are many obvious benefits, you still need to spend your imaging dollars wisely. First of all, scanning costs money. You'll need some kind of software to retrieve those images, probably a database of some kind. If you're doing the imaging yourself, you'll need software to do the scanning itself. Maybe the scanner comes with its own software, maybe it doesn't. And if you are doing it yourself, you'll probably be purchasing hardware, maybe some computers, definitely some scanning equipment, and these things are expensive. Server storage is expensive. Scanning is not going to be the end of paying for storage. It's just that you'll be paying for server space instead of warehouse space. Maybe you're seeing a theme here. So quality control is expensive. Preparing boxes for scanning, making sure every image is checked for completeness and accuracy. These are resource-intensive tasks that humans have to do. Indexing is expensive. It takes time to assign metadata to every single document to make it retrievable. The more search terms you add to each document, the more time someone is spending on each document, and therefore more money. And then digital preservation, or maintaining these digital files, these digital assets that you're creating over time, that is also expensive. You have to keep your hardware and software up to date. Rapid technological changes means rapid technological obsolescence. And then each time you migrate a record or change your software or change a file format, you risk losing data. And that can become expensive, particularly if you are sued and you can't produce or access a record that you're supposed to have. So planning can help mitigate these risks. So now the when, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. We're going to look at a few questions. When is imaging beneficial? When is imaging right for the project? So we'll talk about feasibility studies. When should you destroy the paper source document, and when should you delete the image itself? So we talked about the benefits of imaging, faster retrieval, easier sharing and dissemination, etc. But is imaging right for everything? When is imaging beneficial? Should you just go ahead and scan all paper files and just be completely paperless? Well, these next few slides are based on an article that I really liked by a longtime RIM consultant named Alan Pedraza, who spells out a long list of considerations for determining when it is actually beneficial to scan records and when it might not be. And we're going to look at 4 of those considerations: the goals, the access considerations, the cost, and the return on investment, or ROI. So first, what are your goals? What are you looking to achieve by digitizing the records? Well, first, imaging can be a great way to streamline workflows. Thinking back to our local government compliance database, RMOG, that's an example of a 5 to 10 minute process, sometimes involving travel to another office, reduced to about 30 seconds. And so that has really streamlined that workflow and freed up a lot of time for other tasks. Imaging can greatly improve access to documents. If you have employees in multiple locations who need to be able to access and edit, the same case file, for example, it pretty much has to be digitized for that to work. And access goes hand in hand with dissemination. So for example, the City of Austin came to our eRecords conference last fall and talked about a project where they digitized all of their meeting minutes, all their city council meeting minutes going back to the year 1869, because they were creating this one single public portal to all minutes regardless of date. And that kind of 24/7 access to the public has definitely reduced the amount of time that they spend fulfilling public information requests, because it either eliminates the requests outright because people can already find what they need on the web, or it makes it really easy to respond because you just have to send the person a link. Not to mention, that really increases your agency's transparency to be proactive about putting scanned documents online. Next, reducing your need for physical storage space is a huge goal for a lot of organizations, so space savings might be one of your primary goals. And then maybe disaster recovery is a big driver for you. I heard that after Hurricane Ike hit Galveston a few years ago, a lot of county departments in Galveston County who had flooded offices just wanted to digitize everything to avoid that kind of loss again. And they had to kind of figure out, okay, how can we strategically scan? Do we really need to scan everything? So have a clear idea of what you want to achieve by imaging your records, because that is going to guide a lot of other choices that you make down the line. Now let's look at access considerations. So who will need to access the records? Is it just going to be your own employees, or is it going to be external entities like other agencies or the public? And when will they need to access them? So are these patient records that are so timely that you can't afford not to have immediate access to them, or are they records that you hardly ever need? So we're going to look at an example from our own agency again. We scan copies of state agency retention schedules and put them online for anyone to download. But once a state schedule has been recertified, which they have to do about every 3 years, and the agency has a new schedule, we take down the old schedule. It is so rare that someone wants a copy of a superseded old retention schedule that there is no sense in our hosting that content online. So your access needs should be a big driver of your project. There's no benefit to putting a document online that no one has ever requested or will ever request. Now let's talk about the costs associated with an imaging project. So obviously there are the costs of doing the scanning itself. If you're hiring a vendor, these are the specific things that you'll be charged for. If you're doing them in-house, these are things that you'll need to budget your staff time and resources for. So first, document preparation, removing staples and paper clips, unfolding, taping smaller items like receipts to paper, removal or photocopying of non-standard paper formats like fax paper or that really thin onion skin paper, removing pages from a binding, etc. I have heard vendors say that if you are going to do any part of this imaging project yourself, this is where you can save the most money, by doing the document preparation yourself, because the vendors are really there with kind of the high-tech equipment and machines. They don't know your records as well as you do, so you can probably save money by doing that stuff yourself. Next, scanning, of course. Items that can be sent through a feed scanner can be scanned quickly and therefore more cheaply. But older or more fragile materials, those items have to be scanned using a flatbed scanner, or else they'll crumble into little pieces. And so that costs more. Costs also hinge on the quality of the images. The higher the quality, the higher the cost. The cost of indexing varies widely depending on how thoroughly indexed the records are, how much metadata you want the vendor to create for each record. So having documents OCR'd to become for text recognition, so they can become text searchable, that slows down the process and therefore increases costs. And then electronic document processing, so anything that they do to the electronic document after it's scanned. For example, if you want them to rename each file so that it follows a certain naming convention, that's going to take more time, and so that's going to cost more money. There will be costs associated with developing whatever software system that you use to store and access the image, and those could be two different systems, one to store, one to access. And then there's going to be a lot of ongoing costs. Unless you're storing these images on media like a CD or an external hard drive or a flash drive or something, you're going to have to pay for ongoing server storage. And then you're going to have to pay staff salaries for things like document preparation. You're going to be training people on new systems, maintaining the hardware and software, and then for longer term records, you're probably going to have to think about migrating the images to new file formats in the future. All right, next, this is closely associated with cost, of course, but this is return on investment, ROI considerations. Here is what I have read. If you're implementing a system of scanning documents into active workflows, you can realize ROI within 12 to 18 months. So for example, a new system where you're getting an invoice in, you're scanning it into a system like an EDRMS, an electronic document or records management system. Okay, so scanning it into an active workflow. If you're talking about a record with a 5 or 7 year retention period, like a lot of those financial records, then that is a good investment, right? So ROI within 12 to 18 months, and then you have to keep the record for 5 or 7 years. That's a good return on investment. Okay. Scanning inactive records, which is often referred to as back file conversion, it can take longer to realize the return on your investment. And you may find that it's more cost effective to store that paper in off-site storage until it's met retention and not scan it at all. Here is a really rough estimate. Originally, the lowest estimate I had found for scanning 1 carton of records was $125. Well, I had a conversation with someone yesterday who said probably it's more like $75. So $75 for a standard record storage carton, just a bare minimum, would probably be about $75 to scan 1 box. Okay, so mind you, for preservation scanning, for things, more fragile documents, things are taking, I've seen up to $850 a box, okay? But we're going to go with 75. So anyway, it costs $3.17 to store a box at the State Record Center for 1 year, and that's pretty comparable to commercial vendors, okay? 75 divided by 317 means it would take at least 23 years to see the return on investment. And that would be 39 years if you are paying that $125 per carton. And so in this particular scenario, unless you need to access that box a lot and you're paying a lot of file retrieval costs, and that's where you're looking to save money, it might be more cost effective to just keep storing the paper. How cost effective is it to scan inactive records with expired retention periods? Okay, so stuff that you're not using and it has already met retention. How cost effective is that? It is not cost effective at all. You don't want to scan that stuff. You need to get rid of that stuff. So really, when I talk about choosing strategically, make sure you are not scanning records that have already met retention. That doesn't make any sense. So in brief, when is imaging right for the project under consideration? Now, I have been accused of being an indecisive person, and so instead of just saying yes and no, I had to add probably to the beginning of each column because I can't hope to sit here and tell you all when you should definitely scan and when you should definitely not scan. But here's what I generally think. If the records are active, so they're being frequently used by staff, frequently requested by the public or other agencies, then imaging is probably right for the project. If no one is ever asking for them, then they may not need to be digitized. Same goes if short retrieval time is necessary. If it's a record that is requested often and it really is burdensome to your staff to have to track down a paper folder, imaging is probably right. If multiple people need access to the same record at once, or if that access needs to be constant, so it always needs to be available, maybe on your website, then imaging is probably appropriate. If you will see a quick return on investment and you will realize that ROI before the expiration of that record's retention period, then scan it. If the record will meet its retention before you have recovered the cost of scanning, then it's not worth the money. If there are sufficient resources to support the system over time, so the hardware, the software, the index, the continual creation of metadata for each record going forward, staff time, then scanning is appropriate. If you think you're going to face problems getting that system upgraded or repaired down the line, so if you don't have adequate IT support, if you are at the limit of what you can pay to store your server storage and there's no money to continue to add to that for the continued cost of continuing to scan a particular record if you're still creating it, then you might want to wait until you have secured those resources. If you're scanning something because it's a permanent record and electronic records just seem easier to preserve over time and less hassle than paper records, then that is most definitely not a good reason to scan. Digital imaging should not be used as a long-term preservation strategy. Digital files are actually much more fragile and require much more continual maintenance than paper files. Is that to say that we say don't scan a permanent record? No. We'll get more into that when we talk about source documents. But if you're doing this to replace a paper original because paper seems more difficult than electronic, you have a little more to learn about digital preservation in that case. So, and then finally, if you're wanting to image because it just seems like a good idea to go paperless, then odds are no feasibility studies have been conducted and you shouldn't move forward until they are. So what goes into a feasibility study? Well, this study is the way that you formalize all those factors into something that you can wrap your arms around. A feasibility study is the analysis that an agency really needs to conduct to determine if imaging will solve a problem, and if so, how it will do that. So here are 5 important parts of a feasibility study. First, a needs assessment. And this is where you'll determine what, if any, benefits you will gain by using an imaging system. And a good starting point for this might just be to sit down with the department who creates or uses the records with a whiteboard and a marker and just sketch out where what their workflow is, where the bottlenecks are, and look for those opportunities to streamline. Next, customer satisfaction. So how will all of the users of that record benefit? Think about the internal users and the external users. How much resistance to change is acceptable? Are these people going to learn a new system or a new workflow? Then the alternatives assessment. So that just means considering the alternatives to imaging and how cost effective and practical each of them would be. So the alternatives to imaging would be keeping it in paper and not imaging, or using microfilm, for example. If you're talking about a permanent record, then you would want to consider microfilm, even if you know that there is absolutely no way you're actually going to use it. Look at the costs and the considerations for doing microfilm instead of imaging. Economic feasibility and cost-benefit analyses. Figure out if the expected cost savings, the improvement to productivity, and other benefits will outweigh those initial upfront costs, whether you choose to go with a vendor or buy the equipment and do the scanning yourself. And then make sure the hardware and software and storage media, if you're not storing the records on a network, make sure they're going to integrate with your existing systems. And for that, you're really going to have to sit down with your IT people. Now, I've mentioned destroying the paper document after scanning a few times. Of course, this is often why people want to scan in the first place, to free up storage space or stop paying Iron Mountain or the State Records Center for storage. And this is when you all pick up the phone and call us, because you are all conscientious government records managers who know that there are probably rules about this kind of thing. And of course there are. But there are separate rules for state agencies and local governments. So to keep things simple, we're going to deal with each separately. And we're going to start with local governments. But state agencies, these rules don't apply to you, of course, but so feel free to go check your email for a minute or whatever. But it'll still probably be helpful to listen to this part, because some of the basic concepts really are transferable, even if the rules are different. So first, I mentioned Bulletin B, those standards for maintaining and storing electronic local government records. Well, here's a really important thing to know about Bulletin B. Those rules only apply to records with a retention period of 10 years or more. Why 10 years? That seems arbitrary to some people. Well, because these rules are meant to protect records of long-term value. Believe it or not, when we're talking about electronic records, 10 years is considered long-term, because technology changes at such a rapid pace. And so in 10 years, you can almost guarantee that you'll be using a different computer, different software versions, maybe even different file formats than you used at the time of the creation of that record. So preserving electronic records for the long term does require more of a concerted, deliberate planning effort. And so that is why the rules kick in at 10 years. This is also from Bulletin B. This is the section on source document destruction. You can see the source document for an electronically stored record may be destroyed. right there, before the expiration of its retention period, as long as you are maintaining the storage media, the hardware, and the software necessary to be able to access that record for its full retention period. And the rest of the paragraph basically says you can also elect to delete the electronic version if you're keeping the paper for the full retention period. Essentially, the law is saying as long as you're keeping that record in some readable format for its full retention period, it does not matter what that format is. So now let's talk about source document destruction with longer-term records. So like I said, these rules kick in at the 10-year point. Section 205.008 of the Local Government Code says that the source document may be destroyed if something called an electronic storage authorization request is approved by the state library. Well, we don't have such a request form anymore. That was discontinued a long time ago. This so-called approval is granted when you've met the retention scheduling requirement of the Local Government Records Act. If you look really closely to the Declaration of Compliance that you submit, it includes language in there that says that, you know, if these records are being stored electronically, then you're going to follow the Bulletin B rules, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as you have an approved Declaration of Compliance on file with TSLAC, then you're good, and you can destroy the source document. Now looking at those rules, there are a lot of technical and policy rules attached to storing long-term records electronically. And these rules are getting more into the nitty-gritty of how, you know, the actual technical requirements and things like that. So I'm actually not going to say anything else about the rules here. I believe Mariana will be covering this more in part 2. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. So, okay, turning away from local now. Now state, come back. Email can wait. So now let's look at state agency rules. This will apply to state agencies like Department of State Health Services, TxDOT, state universities, and so forth. So as I said earlier when we introduced Bulletin 1, a state record, a record created by a state agency, may be created or stored electronically. Okay. The law for state agencies actually goes so far as to say that for a state agency, not only can a record be created or stored electronically, the electronic copy has to be accepted as original state record unless another agency's regulation or a rule of court prohibits it. But Bulletin 1 rules apply no matter what the retention is. So the rules for state agencies do not only apply to those long-term, 10 years and longer records. Now looking at archival electronic records, so those records on your retention schedules with archival codes A and R, it's important to think about the long-term viability of these electronic records. They have to be maintained by the agency through all hardware and software migrations until the state archives can take it. Are you prepared to migrate that record indefinitely or keep a bunch of obsolete hardware and software so that you can read that record? Okay, state and local, I'm talking to everybody now. Obviously, there's more at stake when you're talking about a long-term record. Okay, and that's why I kind of belabor that point. But you should be looking beyond the rules, too, when you're considering destroying a source document. First of all, it's a matter of good practice to check with all affected parties before you do go paperless with the process. Make sure there's no legal requirements to keep the original paper documents. So have a conversation with your legal counsel. It could be that there's a litigation hold on certain documents and a judge is requiring that the agency produce originals, so you're not actually allowed to destroy the source document. Talk to your auditors to find out what their requirements are. For example, our accountants here at TSLAC make us keep the original receipts for travel reimbursements because that is what our agency's policy requires. According to our auditors, and according to our accountants, scanned images are easier to manipulate than paper images, and our agency has decided that it doesn't want to take the risk of not being able to prove that a scanned copy is not an authentic, untampered with document. If we find ourselves unable to prove that a steak dinner was an allowable expense, then the agency is out that money, and my agency does not want to buy me a steak dinner. So can you guarantee the authenticity of that scanned record? So here are our general recommendations, and like I said, generally speaking, yes, you are allowed to destroy the source document after scanning no matter what the retention period is, as long as you're following TSLAC's electronic record standards. So yes, state law does allow that. But we're going to make recommendations here that are based on a lot of conversations that we as analysts have had with state and local records managers. So local governments, if it has a retention period of 10 years or more, you might want to consider keeping the source document. I do know one mid-sized municipality who has a blanket policy that if a retention period is 10 years or more, they automatically keep the source document. State agencies, if it has an archival code, A or R, consider keeping the source document. So, and make sure that it's not already eligible for transfer to the state archives. Because if it is, then you may well be able to coordinate with the state archives for them to take the boxes off your hands right now. When you're looking at whether to image or what to image, and you're considering your alternatives, think of the ZDonk. This is a real animal. I found it on the internet. The ZDonk is this actually came up in our meeting, and I'd say we spent a good 5 minutes talking about whether this is actually a real or a mythical creature, and it is real, my friends. It's real. Not to be confused with a Zorse or a Zonkey, okay? But I'm sharing this image to help you remember this. Imaging does not have to be all or nothing. Sometimes a hybrid paper and digital approach is actually less risky and more cost-effective. I know that sometimes, y'all get mandates to go paperless, by a certain date, we're going to go paperless. I'm guessing it's probably not records managers who are issuing such mandates. Digitizing everything in your entire office just probably isn't a good use of your resources. You really do have to take the time to do feasibility studies to figure out if it's good business sense to scan the records and think about TSLAC's recommendations and the risks of long-term digital preservation. So develop a review process. That feasibility study should be part of any imaging project. Make sure you can justify the costs of any digitization project you're doing. Next, scan strategically. Only digitize the records that produce the greatest benefit to your agency or the public and produce the fastest return on investment. And if it's in paper, it hasn't met retention, it's almost never used, then consider sending it to offsite warehouse storage. Offsite storage could actually save you a lot of money. Now, when do you delete that image that you have gone through so much planning and preparing to create and assign metadata terms and rename and make perfect? Well, when it's met its retention period. Even though you do have to pour resources into imaging, you still shouldn't be keeping an electronic record longer than you would keep its paper counterpart. I've heard of a lot of folks who, so-called do their destruction, they get rid of the record, but they're keeping the electronic copies just in case. Well, those of course do become the record copy and subject to any open records requests and litigation requests and subpoena and etc. Just like this paper counterpart would. So get rid of that electronic document just like you get rid of the paper document. So what have you learned about the what, when, and why of planning an imaging project? Well, hopefully you understand that the project does not end at running a sheet of paper through a scanner. Metadata and indexing are really vital to being able to find the record again. You should know that there are a lot of costs associated with imaging, and you should be selective about what you do scan and when you scan it. So take the time to conduct those needs assessments and feasibility studies. And when it comes to the goal of saving space by destroying the original source documents, make sure that you're familiar with Bulletin B or Bulletin 1 and have thought about the potential risks of eliminating the originals. Now, most of you are signed up for Part 2 of the webinar. Part 2, like I said, covers the who and how questions. So doing it yourself versus outsourcing, what are the advantages and the disadvantages to each of them? What the steps are, so how the scanning process actually works when you do it yourself. And what are the rules and requirements, and what decisions are you going to have to make as you plan your project? Should you OCR? How good do the scans need to be? Do they have to be high quality, or will low resolution suffice? What kind of hardware do you need for the records you're scanning? So even though you can now see that we fraudulently promised 5 W's and are only giving you 4, you actually are getting a bonus H in there and a lot of useful information. And with that, I want to thank you for attending. Mariana and I are going to stay on the line as long as you have questions. Next, we're going to go to questions. Do we have any questions?
Okay, the first question that we have is, can you discuss how event-based retention requirements impacts the 10-year rule for imaging?
Well, I guess it would depend on when when the event was going to occur. I mean, if a contract is going to expire 4 years after the date of creation, then you would count 4 years, and then 4 years beyond that, because the retention is AC plus 4, and then you would have 8 years. I mean, the rules basically say that it just applies to records with a retention of 10 years or not. So I guess that just kind of depends in practice. You just have to look at what the closing event is in that particular situation, because you may have a closure event that's 20 years or indefinite, and for those, you'd probably want to consider that long term. So.
Next question. Okay. We have many HR records in PeopleSoft now, and I have been told that there is no way to get records out by retention period, as PeopleSoft does not allow for that. Should I revise our retention schedule to take this into account and make the retention of those records longer, which would be AV with the minimum retention period of state requirements? So the question is, the particular product that they use is not allowed to get records out based on retention, so should that be reflected in the retention schedule?
In general, you want your retention schedule to reflect what you're actually doing. You don't want to have your retention schedule say one thing, but in reality, you're never destroying those records. I've heard about this a lot, so I do a lot of training for justice courts. And justice courts, for example, they use a docketing system that a lot of them, there's absolutely no way for them to pull up a list of records that are eligible for destruction, to run a report based on the disposition of the case and then only destroy those. And it's just a problem with the software. It's a functionality that doesn't exist in the softwares, and all we've been able to tell them is to try to work with the vendor, which is kind of like a haha, good luck kind of thing, like not on our part, but from the lawyers who advise them. But in this case, I think it's one of those like critical mass things. Like all you can do is raise the issue with the vendor, and hopefully that at least like they'll give you the functionality of just running a report, so you know which ones you can actually go in there and press the delete key on. But it really just depends on what you're using. So yeah, you might want to consider putting something on your retention schedule, changing the retention period, or just mentioning that the records are kept in the PeopleSoft system, and I guess I'm just hoping for that functionality down the line.
Okay, here's another question. For student permanent academic records, is it worth turning those to digital, and should the paper still be kept, knowing that storage in high schools is always a really big problem?
Yeah, I totally understand and respect that the storage in high schools is a big problem. However, I would say if there is one group of people that we hear from the most about records going missing, or they can't get a copy of something they need, it is former students who need a copy of or transcript or their student academic record, and the school doesn't have it anymore. Either they lost the paper or they can't access it, or whatever. It's just for whatever reason, it's something that schools struggle with, being able to produce a copy of a record, their permanent academic record for long term. I would say, given where we are right now with our ability to preserve electronic records, kind of following what federal agencies know and what they're doing, I'm still going to recommend keeping the paper copy of a permanent record, because with those academic transcripts, that is something that we know students need, that you have to be able to produce it. And, I don't know that the electronic versions are going to be accessible and retrievable in, 50 years when a student decides to go back to college to get their degree or something. So, yeah, but that's a tough one.
All right, here's another interesting question. For records received and filed in electronic format, most offices do not want to print those documents to paper. For permanent or long-term retention, what is your suggestion for keeping those records permanently, and what are the problems you can see? So records that are received electronically that are permanent or long-term.
Well, okay, so one thing that I heard from, and I thought this was pretty good advice, but when Ryan Ellis, when he was giving that presentation on their EDRMS implementation at our eRecords conference, he said that they just kind of adopted a blanket policy that if it's born digital, keep it digital. They thought that was kind of the most effective, most streamlined way to manage their workflows. And I thought that made sense. I mean, I don't think we're here to tell you to print out things, especially since there's going to be a resistance to that. As far as what the challenges are going to be, I would recommend taking or just checking out our digital preservation webinars. We did a couple webinars called Strategies for Preserving Electronic Records. There's 2 parts, and they kind of talk about the challenges of long-term digital preservation, file format considerations, trying to just anything you can do to try to protect records for the long term, different strategies. So that would hopefully educate people on those risks and challenges.
Great, and we have some expansion on that 10-year event-based retention rule. So the late Michael Heskett maintained that the 10-year rule applied only when the T-SLAC schedule required a 10-plus year retention. So if the retention was expiration of employment plus 5 years, the 10-year rule did not apply. Is that still the position of the Texas State Library?
So, yeah, to clarify, Michael Heskett was the former director of the State and Local Records Management Division. Let me think about this one. Let me research this and just talk with Craig Kelso, our current division director, see where we stand on this, because I don't want to tell you that we have a policy on something that we don't, in fact, have a policy on right now. So, well, if there are no other questions, we will go ahead and end the webinar. But, of course, shoot us an email if there's anything you think of later. And thank you again for coming to our webinar. Okay, have a good day. Goodbye.